The Nagorno-Karabakh War, referred to as the Artsakh Liberation War by Armenians, was an ethnic conflict that took place in the late 1980s to May 1994, in the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh in southwestern Azerbaijan, between the majority ethnic Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh backed by the Republic of Armenia and the Republic of Azerbaijan. As the war progressed, Armenia and Azerbaijan, both former Soviet republics, entangled themselves in a protracted, undeclared war in the mountainous heights of Karabakh as Azerbaijan attempted to curb the secessionist movement in Nagorno-Karabakh. The enclave's parliament had voted in favor of uniting itself with Armenia, and a referendum, boycotted by the Azerbaijani population of Nagorno-Karabakh, was held, whereby most of the voters voted in favor of independence. The demand to unify with Armenia, which began anew in 1988, began in a relatively peaceful manner. However, in the following months, as the Soviet Union's disintegration neared, it gradually grew into an increasingly violent conflict between ethnic Armenians and ethnic Azerbaijanis, resulting in claims of ethnic cleansing by both sides. Inter-ethnic clashes between the two broke out shortly after the parliament of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast in Azerbaijan voted to unify the region with Armenia on the 20th of February 1988. The declaration of secession from Azerbaijan was the final result of a territorial conflict regarding the land, as Azerbaijan declared its independence from the Soviet Union and removed the powers held by the enclave's government. The Armenian majority voted to secede from Azerbaijan and in the process proclaimed the unrecognized Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. Full-scale fighting erupted in the late winter of 1992. International mediation by several groups, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, failed to bring an end resolution that both sides could work with. In the spring of 1993, Armenian forces captured regions outside the enclave itself, threatening the involvement of other countries in the region. By the end of the war in 1994, the Armenians were in full control of most of the enclave and also held and currently control approximately 9% of Azerbaijan's territory outside the enclave. As many as 230,000 Armenians from Azerbaijan and 800,000 Azeris from Armenia and Karabakh have been displaced as a result of the conflict. A Russian-brokered ceasefire was signed in May 1994, and peace talks, mediated by the OSCE Minsk Group, have been held ever since by Armenia and Azerbaijan. Background: the territorial ownership of Nagorno-Karabakh today is still heavily contested between Armenians and Azerbaijanis. The current conflict has its roots in events following World War I. Shortly before the Ottoman Empire's capitulation in the war, the Russian Empire collapsed in November 1917 and fell under the control of the Bolsheviks. The three nations of the Caucasus, Armenians, Azerbaijanis and Georgians, previously under the rule of the Russians, declared the formation of the Transcaucasian Federation, which dissolved after only 3 months of existence. Armenian-Azerbaijani war fighting soon broke out between the First Republic of Armenia and the Azerbaijan Democratic Republic in 3 specific regions: Nakhchivan, Zangezur and Karabakh itself. In Azerbaijan, Armenia and Azerbaijan quarreled about the putative boundaries of the 3 provinces. The Karabakh Armenians attempted to declare their independence but failed to make contact with the Republic of Armenia. Following the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, Armenian General Andronik Kozanian entered Karabakh with military success and was headed towards the region capital of Shusha in December 1918. British troops occupied the South Caucasus in 1919, and the British command suggested Andronik cease his offence and allow the conflict to be solved at the Paris Peace Conference. Afterward, the British provisionally affirmed Azerbaijani statesman Khosrov Sultanov as the Governor-General of Karabakh and ordered him to squash any unrest in the region. Afterward followed the Shusha massacre of an estimated 20,000 Armenians. Soviet division. 2 months later, however, the Soviet 11th Army invaded the Caucasus, and within 3 years, the Caucasian republics were formed into the Transcaucasian SFSR of the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks thereafter created a 7-member committee, the Caucasus Bureau, under the supervision of the People's Commissar for Nationalities, the future Soviet ruler Joseph Stalin. The KAV Bureau was tasked to head up matters in the Caucasus. On the 4th of July 1921, the committee voted 4-3 in favor of allocating Karabakh to the newly created Soviet Socialist Republic of Armenia, but a day later the KAV Bureau reversed its decision and voted to leave the region within Azerbaijan SSR. The Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Oblast was created in 1923, leaving it with a population that was 94% Armenian. The reversal was substantiated with the economic connections the region had with Azerbaijan. The capital was moved from Shusha to Kankendi, which was later renamed as Stepanakert. Armenian and Azeri scholars have speculated that the decision was an application of the principle of divide and rule by Soviet Union. This can be seen, for example, by the odd placement of the Nakhichevan enclave, which is separated by Armenia but is a part of Azerbaijan. Others have also postulated that the decision was a goodwill gesture by the Soviet government to help maintain good relations with Ataturk's Turkey. Over the following decades of Soviet rule, the Armenians retained a strong desire for unification of Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia, an aim that some members of the Armenian Communist Party attempted to accomplish. First Secretary of the Communist Party of Armenia Agassi Khanjan was murdered by deputy head of the NKVD Lavrenti Beria after submitting Armenian grievances to Stalin, which included requests to return Nagorno-Karabakh and Nakhichevan to Armenia. The Armenians insisted that the national rights had been suppressed and their cultural and economic freedoms were being curtailed. Revival of the Karabakh issue. After Stalin's death, Armenian discontent began to be voiced. In 1963, around 2,500 Karabakh Armenians signed a petition calling for Karabakh to be put under Armenian control or to be transferred to Russia. Also in 1963, there were violent clashes in Stepanakert, leading to the death of 18 Armenians. In 1965 and 1977, there were large demonstrations in Yerevan, which also called for unifying Karabakh with Armenia. As the new General Secretary of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in 1985, he began implementing his plans to reform the Soviet Union. These were encapsulated in 2 policies, perestroika and glasnost. While perestroika had more to do with economic reform, glasnost, or openness, granted limited freedom to Soviet citizens to express grievances about the Soviet system itself and its leaders. Capitalizing on this new policy of Moscow, the leaders of the Regional Soviet of Karabakh decided to vote in favor of unifying the autonomous region with Armenia on the 20th of February 1988. The resolution read, welcoming the wishes of the workers of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region to request the Supreme Soviets of the Azerbaijani SSR and the Armenian SSR to display a feeling of deep understanding of the aspirations of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh and to resolve the question of transferring the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region from the Azerbaijani SSR to the Armenian SSR, at the same time to intercede with the Supreme Soviet of the USSR to reach a positive resolution on the issue of transferring the region from the Azerbaijani SSR to the Armenian SSR. On the 24th of February, Boris Kevorkov, the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region Party Secretary and an Azerbaijan loyalist, was dismissed. Karabakh Armenian leaders complained that the region had neither Armenian language textbooks in schools nor in television broadcasting, and that Azerbaijan's Communist Party General Secretary Heydar Aliyev had extensively attempted to Azerify the region and increase the influence and the number of Azeris living in Nagorno-Karabakh, while at the same time reducing its Armenian population. By 1988, the Armenian population of Karabakh had dwindled to nearly three-quarters of the total population. The movement was spearheaded by popular Armenian figures and found support among intellectuals in Russia as well. According to journalist Thomas Deval, some members of the Russian intelligentsia, such as the dissident Andrei Sakharov, expressed support for Armenians. More prominent support for the movement among the Moscow elite was interpreted by some in the public. In November 1987, Humanité published the personal comments made by Abel Aganbegyan, an economic advisor to Gorbachev, to Armenians living in France, in which he suggested that Nagorno-Karabakh could be ceded to Armenia. Prior to the declaration, Armenians had begun to protest and stage worker strikes in Yerevan, demanding a unification with the enclave. This prompted Azeri counter-protests in Baku. After the demonstrations in Yerevan to demand unification of Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia began, Gorbachev met with two leaders of the Karabakh movement, Zori Balayan and Silva Karputikyan, on the 26th of February 1988. Gorbachev asked them for a one-month moratorium on demonstrations. When Karputikyan returned to Armenia the same evening, she told the crowds the Armenians triumphed, although Gorbachev hadn't made any concrete promises. According to Svante Kornell, this was an attempt to pressure Moscow. On March 10, Gorbachev stated that the borders between the republics would not change, in accordance with Article 78 of the Soviet Constitution. Gorbachev also stated that several other regions in the Soviet Union were yearning for territorial changes, and redrawing the boundaries in Karabakh would thus set a dangerous precedent. But the Armenians viewed the 1921 KAV Bureau decision with disdain and felt that in their efforts they were correcting a historical error through the principle of self-determination, a right also granted in the Constitution. Azeris, on the other hand, found such calls for relinquishing the territory by the Armenians unfathomable and aligned themselves with Gorbachev's position. On the 19th of February 1988, during the seventh day of the Armenian rallies, the first counter-protest was held in Baku. The poet Bakhtiar Vahabzadeh and the historian Suleiman Alirov published an open letter in the newspaper Azerbaijan, declaring that Karabakh was historically Azerbaijani territory. Askern and Sumgate ethnic infighting soon broke out between Armenians and Azerbaijanis living in Karabakh. It is claimed as early as the end of 1987 Azerbaijanis from the villages of Garpan and Megra in Armenia were forced to leave their homes as a result of tensions between them and their Armenian neighbors, and in November 1987 two freight cars full of Azerbaijanis are alleged to have arrived at the train station in Baku. In later interviews, the mayors of the two villages denied that any such tension existed at the time, and no such documentation has been adduced to support the notion of forced expulsions. On the 20th of February 1988, two Azerbaijani trainee female students in Stepanakert Hospital were allegedly raped by Armenians. On the 22nd of February 1988, a direct confrontation between Azerbaijanis and Armenians near the town of Askeran in Nagorno-Karabakh degenerated into a skirmish. During the clashes, two Azerbaijani youths were killed. One of them was probably shot by a local policeman, possibly an Azerbaijani, either by accident or as a result of a quarrel. On the 27th of February 1988, while speaking on Baku's central television, the Soviet Deputy Procurator Alexander Katusev reported that two inhabitants of the Agdam district fell victim to murder and gave them Muslim names. The clash in Askeran was the prelude to the pogroms in Sumgait, where emotions, already heightened by news about the Karabakh crisis, turned even uglier in a series of protests starting on the 27th of February. Speaking at the rallies, Azerbaijani refugees from the Armenian town of Garpan accused Armenians of murder and atrocities. According to the Soviet media, these allegations were disproved, and many of the speakers were reportedly agents provocateurs. Within hours, a pogrom against Armenian residents began in Sumgait, a city some 25 kilometers north of Baku. The pogroms resulted in the deaths of 32 people, according to official Soviet statistics, although many Armenians felt that the true figure was not reported. Nearly all of Sumgait's Armenian population left the city after the pogrom. Armenians were beaten, raped, mutilated and killed both on the streets of Sumgait and inside their apartments during 3 days of violence that only subsided when Soviet armed forces entered the city and quelled much of the rioting on the 1st of March. The manner in which they were killed reverberated among Armenians, recalling memories of the Armenian genocide. On the 23rd of March 1988, the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union rejected the demands of Armenians to cede Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenia. Troops were sent to Yerevan to prevent protests against the decision. Gorbachev's attempts to stabilize the region were to no avail, as both sides remained equally intransigent. In Armenia, there was a firm belief that what had taken place in the region of Nikishevan would be repeated in Nagorno-Karabakh. Prior to its absorption by Soviet Russia, it had a population which was 40% Armenian. By the late 1980s, its Armenian population was virtually non-existent. Interethnic violence. Armenians refused to allow the issue to subside despite a compromise made by Gorbachev, which included a promise of a 400 million ruble package to introduce Armenian language textbooks and television programming in Karabakh. At the same time, Azerbaijan was unwilling to cede any territory to Armenia. Calls to transfer Karabakh to Armenia briefly subsided when a devastating earthquake hit Armenia on the 7th of December 1988, which leveled the towns of Leninakon and Spitik, killing an estimated 25,000 people. But conflict brewed up once more when the 11 members of the newly formed Karabakh Committee, including the future president of Armenia Levon Ter-Petrosyan, were jailed by Moscow officials in the ensuing chaos of the earthquake. Such actions polarized relations between Armenia and the Kremlin. Armenians lost faith in Gorbachev, despising him even more because of his handling of the earthquake relief effort and his uncompromising stance on Nagorno-Karabakh. In the months following the Sumgate pogroms, a forced population exchange took place as Armenians living in Azerbaijan and Azerbaijanis living in Armenia were compelled to abandon their homes. According to the Azerbaijani government, between 27 and 29 November 1988, 33 Azerbaijanis were killed in Spitik Guguk and Stepanovan and 216 in the 1987 to 1989 period. According to Azerbaijani MP Arif Yunusov, in November of the same year 20 Azerbaijanis from the Armenian village of Vartan were reportedly burned to death. However, according to Armenian sources, the number of Azerbaijanis killed in the 1988–1989 period was 25. Interethnic fighting also spread throughout cities in Azerbaijan, including, in December 1988, in Kirovohrad and Nakhichevan, where 7 people were killed and hundreds injured when Soviet army units attempted once more to stop attacks directed at Armenians. Estimates differ on how many people were killed during the first 2 years of the conflict. The Azerbaijani government alleges that 216 Azerbaijanis were killed in Armenia, while the researcher Arif Yunusov gives 127 to those killed in 1988 alone. An October 1989 piece by Time, however, stated that over 100 people were estimated to have been killed since February 1988, in both Armenia and Azerbaijan. By the end of 1988, dozens of villages in Armenia had become deserted, as most of Armenia's more than 200,000 Azerbaijanis and Muslim Kurds left. While Muslim Kurds did not take up arms against Armenians, almost all of them fled their homes from the Armenian-controlled areas. Black January inter-ethnic strife began to take a toll on both countries' populations, forcing most of the Armenians in Azerbaijan to flee to Armenia and most of the Azeris in Armenia to Azerbaijan. The situation in Nagorno-Karabakh had grown so out of hand that in January 1989 the central government in Moscow temporarily took control of the region, a move welcomed by many Armenians. In September 1989, Popular Front leaders and their ever-increasing supporters managed to institute a railway blockade against Armenia and the enclave, effectively crippling Armenia's economy, as 85% of the cargo and goods arrived through rail traffic. Although some claimed this was a response to Armenia's embargo against Nakhichevan ASSR that had started earlier that summer, the disruption of rail service to Armenia was, accordingly, in part due to the attacks of Armenian militants on Azerbaijani train crews entering Armenia. In January 1990, another pogrom directed at Armenians in Baku forced Gorbachev to declare a state of emergency and send troops from the MVD to restore order. Amid the rising independence movement in Azerbaijan, Gorbachev dispatched the military to dragoon the events. As the Soviet regime inched closer to collapse, Soviet troops received orders to occupy Baku at midnight on January 20, 1990. City residents, who saw tanks coming at about 5 a.m., said the troops were the first to open fire. The Shield Report, an independent commission from the USSR Military Procurator's Office, rejected the military claims of returning fire, finding no evidence that those manning the barricades on the roads to Baku were armed. A curfew was established and violent clashes between the soldiers and the surging Azerbaijan Popular Front were common, in the end leading to the deaths of 120 Azerbaijanis and 8 MVD soldiers in Baku. During this time, however, Azerbaijan's Communist Party had fallen and the belated order to send the MVD forces had more to do with keeping the party in power than with protecting the city's Armenian population. The events, referred to as Black January, also strained the relations between Azerbaijan and the central government. Fighting in Kazakh, Azerbaijan has several exclaves within the territory of Armenia: Yukaryaski-Para, Barkudali and Sofiulu in the northwest, on an exclave of Kaki in the Nakhchivan exclave of Azerbaijan Republic. In early 1990, the road alongside the border village of Baganais came under routine attack by militia members from Azerbaijan. At the same time, Armenian forces attacked both these Azerbaijani enclaves within the Armenian territory and the border villages of Kazakh and Sadarik Rayon in Azerbaijan proper. On the 26th of March 1990, several cars with Armenian paramilitaries arrived in the Armenian border village of Baganais. At dusk, they crossed the border, storming the Azerbaijani village Baganais Irim. About 20 houses were burned and 8 to 11 Azerbaijani villages killed. The bodies of members of one family, including infants, were found in the charred ruins of the burned homes. By the time the Soviet Interior Ministry troops arrived in Baganais Irim, the attackers had already fled. On the 18th of August, a significant accumulation of Armenian militants near the border was observed. The following day, units of the Armenian National Army bombarded Azeri villages Yukseri-Para, Baganais Irim, Asarja-Para and Kasku Irim, and according to eyewitnesses used rocket-propelled grenades and mortars. The first attack was repulsed with additional reinforcements arriving from Yerevan. Armenian forces were able to seize Yukseri-Para and Baganais Irim. On the 20th of August, tanks, anti-aircraft guns and helicopter gunships of the Soviet Army under the command of Major General Yuri Shatalin were brought in, and by the end of the day the Armenians were driven off. According to the Soviet Ministry of Interior, 1 internal ministry officer and 2 police officers were killed. 9 soldiers and 13 residents were injured. According to Armenian media reports, 5 militants were killed and 25 were wounded. According to Azerbaijani media, about 30 were killed and 100 wounded. Operation Ring. In the spring of 1991, President Gorbachev held a special countrywide referendum called the Union Treaty, which would decide if the Soviet republics would remain together. Newly elected, non-communist leaders had come to power in the Soviet republics, including Boris Yeltsin in Russia, Levon Ter-Petrosyan in Armenia, and Ayaz Mutalibov in Azerbaijan. Armenia and 5 other republics boycotted the referendum, whereas Azerbaijan voted in compliance to the treaty. As many Armenians and Azeris in Karabakh began an arms build-up in order to defend themselves, Mutalibov turned to Gorbachev for support in launching a joint military operation in order to disarm Armenian militants in the region, termed Operation Ring. Soviet forces acting in conjunction with the local Azerbaijani OMON forcibly deported Armenians living in the villages of the region of Shahumyan. The operation involved the use of ground troops, military, armored vehicles and artillery. The deportations of the Armenian civilians were carried out with gross human rights violations documented by international human rights organizations. Ring was perceived by both Soviet and Armenian government officials as a method of intimidating the Armenian populace to giving up the demands for unification. Operation Ring proved counterproductive to what it had originally sought to accomplish. The violence that took place during the operation only reinforced the belief among Armenians that the only solution to the Karabakh conflict was through armed resistance. The initial Armenian resistance inspired volunteers to start forming irregular volunteer detachments. First attempt to mediate peace. First peace mediation efforts were started by the Russian President Boris Yeltsin and Kazakhstan President Nursultan Nazarbayev in September 1991. After peace talks in Baku, Ganja, Stepanakert and Yerevan on 20–23 September, the sides agreed to sign the Zheleznovosk communique in the Russian city of Zheleznovosk, taking the principles of territorial integrity, non-interference in internal affairs of sovereign states, observance of civil rights as a base of the agreement. The agreement was signed by Yeltsin, Nazarbayev, Mutalibov, and Petrosian. The peace efforts came to a halt due to continuing bombardment and atrocities by Azerbaijani OMON in Stepanakert and Chapa in late September, with the final blow being the Azerbaijani Mi-8 helicopter shoot-down near the village of Karakend in the Martuna district, with peace-mediating team, consisting of Russian, Kazakh observers and Azerbaijani high-ranking officials on board. Conflict in the last days of the USSR. In late 1991, Armenian militias launched offensives to capture Armenian-populated villages seized by Azerbaijani OMON in May–July 1991. Leaving these villages, the Azerbaijani units in some cases burned them. According to the Moscow-based human rights organization Memorial, at the same time, as a result of attacks by Armenian armed forces, several thousand residents of Azerbaijani villages in the former Shahumian, Hadrat, Martakert, Asker and Martuna regions of Azerbaijan had to leave their homes, too. Some villages were burned by the militants. There were instances of serious violence against the civilian population, starting in late autumn of 1991, when the Azerbaijani side started its counter-offensive. The Armenian side began targeting Azerbaijani villages. According to Memorial, the villages Milibaili and Gushchula, from which Azeri forces regularly bombarded Stepanakert, were attacked by Armenians, where the houses were burned and dozens of civilians were killed. Each side accused the other of using the villages as strategic gathering points, covering the artillery positions. On the 19th of December, internal ministry troops began to withdraw from Nagorno-Karabakh, which was completed by the 27th of December. With the collapse of the Soviet Union and the withdrawal of internal troops from Nagorno-Karabakh, the situation in the conflict zone became uncontrollable.